Okay, so uh, third installment in the series on how to write a critical analysis. So, in getting launched, Trimble says that in order to generate ideas, theses, sort of leads on what it is that you might do when you actually sit down to write. Uh, a rough draft of your critical analysis. Uh, you need to pose tough questions. Uh, so to generate facts and ideas, formulate a variety of questions, both general and specific, such as a tough examiner might ask. Why, who, how, when, where, and bombard your subject with them. Notice I have an image here that might be from a movie before your time, before you're actually born. Maybe some of you seen My Cousin Vinny, and this is Joe Pesci doing a very, very tough and good job at a cross examination of a witness in a really, really funny film. Uh, and at the top of the PowerPoint slide, you see pose some tough questions. Notice the word quest is etymologically a part of the word questions. They have similar meanings or connotations. And so when you're asking questions, you're questing for something. And so think of the process of writing a critical analysis as not something that you know the answer to straight out of the gates. You shouldn't have a plan of attack. This is about coming up with a plan. So, questing, asking questions, rummaging around in the text for data, for textual evidence, just thinking about the text, right? And thinking in a focused way by asking good questions, good penetrating questions, can actually help you to get a lot of mileage towards discovering what it is that you're really enthusiastic or interested in potentially writing about in a critical analysis. And these initial stages, okay? Asking tough questions is really, really important after you found your subject. And I really like the active, the vividly active sound of the word bombard, right? Uh, so really go at your subject, theme, or topic, or subjects, plural, themes, and topics uh, with a certain degree of gusto and vigor. Be aggressive. Okay, next slide. Uh, the spiritual power, authenticity, and integrity of the good or great how or why question. Okay, newsflash. Experience strongly suggests that a good or great how or why question can lead to states of mystic unity with the minds of exquisitely interesting and wise souls. Notice for the quoting model, I use Kathleen Jamie's Aurora, and she's literally uh, or virtually, however you prefer, standing on my head right now. So when I say talk about the spiritual power, the authenticity and integrity of a good or great how or why question, uh, I think it's really, really important, as Trimble says, to follow your feelings when it comes to choosing a text, a subject, topic, or theme, something that you're really invested in, something you're really hungry to find out, right? You want to be enriched by this process. And a good how or why question can actually help us to access uh, the spirit of a particular uh, work of literature or text. The powers, the energies, intellectual, imaginative, emotional, what have you, that really animate a work of art, like, for instance, Kathleen Jamie's Aurora. So, my experience strongly suggests to me, along with my colleagues and people who have had ample experience writing critical analyses and writing about literature, and writing about how it is that literature uh, utilizes its magic to move us, to think, to feel, to provoke us to ask questions, to wake us up. Uh, all of these things can be achieved through asking a good or great how or why question. Okay. So Trimble suggests the 5 by note card exercise, an exercise whereby you continue to bombard your topic, subject, or theme with questions, preferably how or why questions. And he asks you to ask both general and specific questions that generate ideas to ultimately get to the point where you think you have an argument and you're willing to try out, several different thesis statements. And so the 5 by note card exercise, which I still utilize when I am getting ready to write a journal article, it's really, really effective uh, just to help to brainstorm and get your thoughts moving. And sort of, it also helps to develop uh, a kind of continuity of thinking that is rich, that is complicated, that you'll have to draw on when you sit down to write the rough draft. In fact, when you write the rough draft, you should be chomping at the bit to get everything that you've thought about like onto the page. This is what Trimble refers to as a zero draft. Sometimes people refer to them as splat drafts. So I highly recommend after you go through this process, right, do a splat draft when you are trying to get towards the point where you think you know what your thesis is and what is it you're going to argue, but you're not exactly sure. The rough draft or the zero draft is a time to just test things out. But before you get to the point where you're testing thesis statements and ideas and arguments out, it's best to ask general and specific how or why questions. And this kind of models what it is that I did when I anticipated writing the quoting model that you all have read on Kathleen Jamie's Aurora. So here's an example of a general question. Uh, and at this point in the process, I was just focused on nature or the natural world. That was my subject. The other subjects and topics and themes came a little bit later, like, for instance, sympathy, indigenous peoples, climate change, what have you. So I started general and then I worked my way down and narrowed my focus eventually. Point is, I engaged in this process and I asked myself a whole host of general and specific questions. So, example of a general question: how does Kathleen Jamie's Aurora represent or portray the natural or non-human world? And at this point in the process, after you formulate a question like this, don't censor yourself. The first thoughts that come to mind, just follow them. Things don't have to be grammatically correct. Your writing doesn't have to be polished. Nobody's going to see it at this point. So just you're writing notes to yourself. And so I'm answering this question. Okay, well, if I consult my memory, in the natural world, since we're in the Arctic, it's really cold. But it's also cold, it seems, in the metaphorical sense or the figurative sense. It's actually quite chilling how colossal and vast and silent uh, that the Arctic landscape is in this particular essay. I think Jamie does a really good job at portraying or conveying through language an approximation of what it's actually like to be in a place like Greenland or the Arctic. And it's terribly cold, and there are plenty of references to cold. Notice that I refer to the page numbers where she refers to the cold, how chilling it is, how if you accidentally as you're getting out of a zodiac and going on to land, If you get your foot wet, you might have to go back to the ship to receive medical attention. It's that cold. She makes a big point of that. But it's also cold in the metaphorical sense. And also, as I'm speaking here, I'm reminded that she does this thing with cold and warmth. It makes me think that both the cold and the warmth, they don't just refer to physical states of being, but they're also complex metaphors, maybe even multi-layered metaphors that mean more than one thing simultaneously. I also noticed that, especially when she talks about the auroras, the natural world in the Arctic is beautiful. It's fascinating, captivating, wondrous, and enthralling. In fact, words don't do justice quite to the effects that this particular landscape has on Jamie. But she, as a poet, is able to cobble woods together in this essay in a way that really does make one yearn to be able to go to a place like this. Um, I also notice, again, in keeping with this notion that the natural world is represented as physically cold, but also cold in the metaphorical sense, she refers to the witless indifference of nature. There are various references to the indifferent and personal nature of nature in this particular essay. And another thing that I noticed here that seemed kind of I don't know, curious. It just occurred to me that she constantly refers to matter and the material world. And she kind of weirdly focuses on the brute and substantial or crude physicality of stuff, icebergs, rock, bone, so on and so forth. I don't know what that means right now, but the point is that I'm weaving a kind of web or a network of thought that is going to come in handy later on when I'm thinking about what it is I want to argue, what my thesis statement will look like, and what the general thrust or import of the paper might be or look like once it's all said and done. Okay, Trimble says, do as many 5-byte note card exercises as you can, right? Save them, and then go back, look through them later on to generate ideas. And believe me, this is not rocket science. You just have to put the work into it. You have to build up the thinking, the momentum of thought, in order to get to the point where you have something really interesting to say about your experience reading aspects of or a particular aspect of this particular text that you've chosen to write about. And so here's an example of a specific question. 5-byte note card exercise continued. Just as I was looking through for textual examples of the indifference of the natural world, I ran across this line that got me thinking. And it's just before Kathleen and her friend Polly go out onto the deck and brave the cold in the middle of night after they hear on the PA, the public announcement system on the ship, that the auroras are burning bright and vivid and all their glory. You need to come out and see this natural spectacle that is such a rare thing for human beings to have the privilege, the chance to be able to see. And when Kathleen gets out there, she asks Polly, where is everybody else? We have paid good money to come from our homes. We flew here, grabbed all our gear, and, really planned, long and hard for this trip. Why aren't they out seeing the auroras? And then Polly says, kind of wryly, and I think perhaps humorously, as I imagine her through the eyes of Jamie in this particular essay, she says, her response is, perhaps they are asleep. There's something that seemed to be both humorous and serious and curiously suggestive about that answer. And it made me think that, well, she says, okay, not just literally asleep, but asleep in a metaphorical sense, perhaps. And so, answers to the question, I just jot them down real quick, right? It shouldn't take more than a minute or two. When Kathleen asks Polly where everyone is when they're viewing the auroras, why does Polly say perhaps they are asleep? Well, one, because Polly thinks they're metaphorically asleep or numb or somehow afraid to really engage with the weird or chilling or indifferent beauty of nature. Oh, there's a thought. See if it comes handy later on. Second answer. The natural world and the relentless cold of the Arctic reminds them, those who are downstairs in the comfort and warmth of their beds down below in the cabin of the ship, the natural world and the relentless cold of the Arctic reminds them at some conscious or semi-conscious level, maybe even an unconscious level, of their vulnerability with respect to the natural world, or their impermanence, or their animality, their mortality, all of these different things. It seems as though being out of the context of home or civilization or society, where we are crowded by information, distractions, and we're busy and we just don't have the time to pay attention. Now all of a sudden they're paying attention to the natural world, right? Or the earth as it has been for millions and millions of years. And all of a sudden they're reminded of all of these different things. And maybe it's a little bit too much. As I suggest right here, the beauty and the spectacle of the auroras, along with the constant reminders how ancient, how old the earth is and how short our lives are, is too much or enough. I hear that word a lot in the essay, or quite a lot, or too much to bear. And notice that I come up with page numbers to refer back to if I want to follow up on this line of thinking when I take a stab at developing thesis statements whereby I argue X, Y, Z, what have you, right? And then attempt to substantiate my thesis statement by utilizing aspects of the text or quotes, passages, lines, words, phrase that help me to be able to make my case that my argument is sound, that I'm not hallucinating, right? I'm just not just making stuff up. I've done my homework here, right? Okay. I'm only doing 3 5-byte note card exercises, but if I were you, I would do at least 3 or more just to build up some thought. This doesn't take a lot of time, trust me. 15 to 20 minutes a day, half hour, what have you, it's time well spent, right? And it'll save you a lot of anxiety and panic later on, believe me. So I strongly, as a humanitarian soul, encourage you to partake of these exercises that Trimble, this wise old dog, has for us in his chapters, Getting Launch, Quoting, and How to Write a Critical Analysis. And by the way, if you feel any uncertainty as you move through this process, you can refer back to this video lecture, and you can also refer back to Trimble. Trimble is much more experienced than I am, and is, I have to say, probably more skilled than I am when it comes to teaching the critical analysis. And so those chapters that I gave you from Writing with Style, Conversations on the Art of Writing, they're there to help you, right? And you should have them there in your holsters, ready to pull them out and use them when you're in a tough spot, right? When you're feeling doubt, uncertainty, when you feel stalled, so to speak, right? Because this is a difficult process. And we need to remind ourselves we need patience because it is indeed a process. And you have to go through the process to be able to make headway towards developing a good, strong, or arguable thesis statement that develops into a solid argument. Okay? So another specific question. Why does Jamie so briefly and subtly, which is to say perhaps artfully, refer to Greenland's indigenous peoples at the beginning, the very first page, and towards the end of the essay, the second to last page, page 17. Quick answers to these questions. I don't have to think a lot, right? Because reading this text has already engendered a lot of thinking on my part, and I'm just going back and capturing these thoughts and then expanding on the thoughts that came as a consequence of reading the text. Okay, so the first answer to the question spontaneously comes to mind. Just jot it down because she feels it's somehow important to remind the reader of how tough and ingenious a human being needs to be to live, survive, and thrive in this formidable landscape. Hats off to these people. I mean, respect. Seriously. Can you begin to imagine this particular essay intimates or suggests what life would be like on this massive island, Greenland? It is so formidable, so cold, so perilous, inhospitable, what have you, right? And can you imagine like the immense resources that human beings would have to draw from, right? The resources of intelligence, our capacity for logic and reason, and art and artfulness, and also respect for others, respect for the natural world, love for others, curiosity about the natural world, how it works, all the things that a human being, not just an individual human being, but a human collective needs in order to be able to survive in this particular climate, in this ecosystem, in this rugged part of the world. Yes, we can begin to imagine that, and perhaps that's what she wants us to do. In fact, as I continue to think here, I think that this could be a promising uh, direction that I might wish to take in the critical analysis. I'd like to focus on this curious gesture of referring subtly or artfully and briefly to indigenous peoples and societies in this particular essay. I want to follow up on what's going on here, right? I want to think about this some more. Second attempt at an answer to the question. Well, why does she do it so subtly and artfully and briefly? So that we barely notice it, but nevertheless, like we're like invited to notice these things, to pay attention. Well, because she wants to remind the reader in a way that isn't moralistic, preachy, knowing, or self-righteous that climate change, produced by, as we all know, capitalist consumer societies, is imperiling and may even annihilate the culture or cultures of indigenous peoples in places like Greenland, not to mention the wisdom that it contains. Maybe it's tragic, right? Indeed, after reading this, I'm reminded that it is tragic how we who live in so-called modern, sophisticated, or advanced, civilized societies don't seem to be curious or can be bothered to care about the lives, the cultures, and the intricacies of indigenous peoples and societies. And with climate change becoming something that is very much on people's minds more and more and more, is this she's beckoning us, imploring us in a respectful and humble and unassuming, even charitable generous way to just consider these people's lives. Pay attention, read up about them, study them. You're in college, you're in university. Get to know the world, right? Be a part of it, actively participate in it, joyfully embrace it, and come to know it. Uh, a critical analysis is, I would like to think, a genre of writing, right, that helps us to deepen our appreciation and enjoyment and understanding of the wisdom and the values, right, and the love that art, specifically literary art, uh, embodies, what it can do for us. So I highly encourage you to go through this process. You need to take the time. You cannot wait till the last moment to do this. Give it a shot. Okay. And so I'll have another screencast video lecture up in the next several days. Once you've had the time to be able to digest what it is that I've said in this video lecture, and actually engage in the 5x8 note card exercises, and generate some how or why questions, answer them, get your thinking moving, right? One of the answers to those how or why questions, if you go back and look at them after you set them aside for a day or two, that might be a thesis statement in an embryonic sort of developing crude form that you can elaborate and develop and refine through the course of time. While you're writing your rough draft, you go back and edit and write the first draft, and then you polish it off, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of time for this piece to evolve, and you need to allow time for a critical analysis to evolve. Okay, sock goes in the mouth, done. See ya.